They were never called hostages. That word was too honest, too dangerous. Instead, history chose softer language: sent to be educated, placed under protection, invited to observe foreign courts. But behind every polite phrase, there was a rule no one wrote down. She does not return until the treaty survives. In medieval Europe, treaties were fragile. Ink dried faster than loyalty. Borders shifted. Kings lied. And wars restarted with a single signature. So power needed something stronger than paper. It needed a body, a living guarantee. And no body carried more value, or more silence, than a princess. Royal marriages were public acts. Royal hostages were private ones. A bride crossed borders with celebration. A hostage crossed borders quietly. No wedding bells. No formal vows. No promises of return. Just a procession small enough to avoid attention and large enough to remind everyone watching that she mattered, not as a woman, as leverage. The logic was brutal and painfully simple. If a king breaks the treaty, he risks more than war. He risks his daughter. And unlike soldiers, a princess could not defect, could not escape, could not be exchanged publicly. Her captivity was never acknowledged, which meant her disappearance could never be protested. These arrangements appeared, most often in unstable regions, border kingdoms, new dynasties, empires stretched too thin to trust promises. Instead of demanding land, or gold, or soldiers, they demanded presence. A royal girl, placed inside a foreign court, raised under watch, and denied the one thing that would give her power, a future. She was not imprisoned in chains. That would be too obvious. She lived in chambers, attended court, learned the language, followed protocol. But every letter she wrote was read first. Every visitor approved. Every step measured. Her life was paused until politics decided whether it could resume. And this is where history becomes deliberately vague, because chroniclers knew how to describe prisoners of war. They did not know how to describe a royal hostage, who was never supposed to be named as one. So they wrote phrases like, "She remained at court. Her return was postponed. Circumstances required her continued presence." Circumstances. Always circumstances. What no chronicle explained was the psychological function of these women. They were reminders. Every feast, every negotiation, every dispute. Someone could always look across the hall and see her, and remember what would be lost if peace collapsed. In some courts, the hostage princess was kept deliberately visible. In others, she was hidden away after the initial months, not out of mercy, out of risk, because over time, sympathy grew, and sympathy weakened leverage. A hostage must remain symbolic, not human. These arrangements could last years, sometimes decades. A princess sent at 14 might still be there at 30, unmarried, unclaimed, politically frozen, too valuable to release, too dangerous to execute, too inconvenient to explain. And then there were the rules. Rules never written, but always enforced. She could not marry without permission from both courts. She could not inherit land. She could not leave the territory under any pretext. Illness was documented, recovery monitored. Death was complicated, because a dead hostage no longer guaranteed anything, which meant that when treaties failed and wars resumed, some princesses did not die immediately. They simply stopped appearing. There are gaps in royal records that last years, entire lifetimes, compressed into silence. A name appears once, sent to reside, and never appears again. No marriage. No burial. No return. Just absence. This is not coincidence. It is design. Because the perfect hostage is one whose fate never becomes public. No execution to condemn. No scandal to weaponize. Just quiet removal from the political equation. And here is the most unsettling truth. Many of these princesses were never told the real reason. They were being sent away. They were told it was temporary, educational, an honor. The truth, that their safety depended on men who might betray each other, was never explained. Because informed hostages resist. Uninformed ones comply. By the late medieval period, this system became normalized. So normalized that some courts began to prefer hostages over marriages. A wife creates claims. Children, inheritance disputes. A hostage creates only fear. Clean, silent, effective, but systems built on silence always crack. And when they did, when treaties collapsed, when wars reignited, these women were suddenly liabilities. And that is where the real horror begins. Because in the next stage of this story, we will confront what happened to royal hostages when peace failed, and why some princesses never survived the collapse of ink. If you're still listening, you already understand something history avoided saying out loud. Some women were not married to power. They were held by it. Treaties never failed loudly. They failed quietly. In letters burned. In meetings held after midnight. In orders delivered without seals. And when treaties collapsed, the hostage became a problem. Not a person. A problem. Because once war returned, the presence that once guaranteed peace became a liability, a living reminder of a promise that no longer existed. And courts do not keep reminders of their own failures. At first, nothing seemed to change. The princess still lived at court, still appeared at ceremonies, still followed protocol. But something shifted. Fewer visitors, shorter appearances, longer silences. Letters stopped leaving the palace. And then, she stopped appearing altogether. This is where historians encounter what they politely call gaps in documentation. Years missing. No explanations. A woman sent at 14 simply vanishes from the record at 22. No burial. No illness. No return. Just an ending without words. Some chroniclers hint at what happened. They speak of relocation, transfer of residence, spiritual retreat. These phrases appear suddenly, after political collapse. Never before. Never explained. In certain regions, hostage princesses were moved to religious institutions, not as novices, not as nuns, but as containment. A cloister was safer than a cell. No guards, no bars, just vows no one ever asked her to take. A woman who cannot leave, without technically being imprisoned. In other cases, the solution was even colder. The hostage was declared ill, not publicly dying. That required witnesses. Just unwell. Too unwell to appear. Too unwell to travel. Too unwell to be discussed. Until one day, she was simply never mentioned again. And here lies the most disturbing pattern. The moment a treaty failed, records involving the hostage became deliberately ambiguous. Names replaced with pronouns. Events described without dates. Outcomes implied, never stated. It was bureaucratic erasure. A disappearance executed with ink. But not all hostages vanished quietly. Some became examples. Warnings. In rare cases, a princess would be returned, but not as she left. Stripped of status. Stripped of relevance. politically neutralized, alive, but removed from every future calculation. And then there were the executions that were never called executions. Accidents, sudden illnesses, falls from horses, deaths that occurred conveniently, after diplomatic collapse, and were never investigated, because no one wanted to ask, what happens when a guarantee loses its value? What makes this system so effective is not cruelty. It is plausible deniability. No chains, no trials, no blood in the square. Just a woman who stops existing publicly, which is far harder to condemn. And remember this: these women had no legal status as prisoners, which meant they had no rights. As prisoners, they could not be exchanged, could not be ransomed, could not be defended. They were never meant to survive peacebreaking, only peace itself. By the early modern period, this practice began to fade, not because it was condemned, but because it became risky. Information traveled faster. Public scrutiny grew. A missing princess was harder to erase. So the system adapted. Hostages became marriages. Guarantees became bloodlines. But the logic never disappeared. It simply changed shape. And that leaves us with the truth. History never confronts directly. Some princesses were not sent away to be educated. They were sent away to be held. And when peace failed, they were disposed of, without noise, without trial, without memory. Royal history celebrates alliances, treaties, dynasties, but it avoids asking what those agreements cost, the people used to enforce them. If you want to uncover the history written in silence, the stories buried between lines, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next episode, we follow the women who survived being hostages and discover what they lost, even after freedom returned.